Hello, friends, and welcome to the second part of this study of William Z. Foster's History of the Three Internationals. Before we start, I would like to thank two people in particular. Uh, Matt Cedillo, along with his friend Dr. Jose Prado, um, for doing their study on capital, Marx's Capital, which they have given me the privilege of posting on this channel. You can go back and look at that. There's a link on my latest live to his channel, and you can get the live version of that study on capital on Mondays. And also, you can ask him about purchasing his book of poetry. Another thank you has got to go to um, journalist, international speaker, and author Caleb Maupin, um, writer of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age,
Great book. I recommend it.
who suggested, um, who very passionately and articulately suggested the reading material that we're going over. I'm actually going to introduce today the second international. We're going to do the complete section. Hopefully, there's no technical difficulties today, and we go right through. Almost was it over 80 pages today? It was over 100 pages last time. But I'm actually going to read a section of City Builders and Vandals in Our Age about the Second International. For anybody who has this book at home, this is page 25. The section entitled Imperialism in the Crisis of Marxism. The Marxist movement proliferated across Europe, most especially after the death of its founding, quote, prophet, unquote. In 1883, the Second International emerged as a continent-wide mass movement, with the German SPD as its flagship organization. Millions of working class people joined Marxist, labor, and social democratic parties. Unions fought for the rights of factory workers, universal male suffrage, restriction on the length of the workday, and union representation on the job were established in many parts of Europe. Socialist deputies were elected to many parliaments. Marx's writings were broadly distributed. The institutions of Marxist studies were established. The United States was not left out of the rise in socialist consciousness. Activist Edward Bellamy, scientific fiction novel Looking Backward, was published in 1888. The text told of a beautiful, futuristic USA in which the rule of profits had been eliminated. The human beings lived in comfort and cooperation. The book created a sensation across the USA as a bestseller. People inspired by the novel formed nationalist clubs to promote the vision Bellamy narrative presented. Among those who promoted his socialist vision was Edward Bellamy's cousin, Francis Bellamy. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister who later composed the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. The Daniel De Leon Socialist Labor Party of America, and eventually the much larger Socialist Party of America, led by Eugene Debs, began to spread Marxist gospel of social revolution and rational economics across the American heartland. Debs traveled in a red train car from city to city, calling for the working class to take its place as the master of U.S. society. Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, John Reed, Lincoln Steffens, and other socialist journalists exposed the crimes of the rich and powerful. The industrial workers of the world organized the desperately low income and immigrant trade industrial unions who were rejected by American Federation of Labor for being, quote, unskilled. In the first decades of the 20th century, Marxism was everywhere in the Western world, and the working class was more organized than ever before. But socialist revolutions did not occur. Scholars began to write about the crisis of Marxism because it seemed that while Marx's idea had widely proliferated, they did not manifest in the predicted proletarian revolution they were intended to create. The crisis of Marxism and the lack of revolutions and uprising occurred because the global economy was changing. Factory owners were being upstarted by bankers. As international cooperations based in Western capitals spread themselves across the world, the living standings for some strata and the home lines were rising. Writing from Russia, Lenin described this new global order as, quote, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, quote. Lenin wrote, quote, imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, morbid capitalism. The supplementing of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quaintness of imperialism. Monopoly masses. Okay, that's enough for that book. I think that really almost summarizes this section. Basically, we're going to talk today about the Second International. The Second International was in probably the most productive period of capitalism, or the very ending period of capitalism, where capitalism was building up, intensifying, building energy. And then when it became imperialist, it became destructive, and it made it harder for revolutions in those countries. And because of the later on in the Third International, it made it hard because of the absolute power of the banking class. But during that time period, it was development of opportunism, where labor unions, not working, but petty bourgeois trade unions, allied themselves with their own country and the interests of their bourgeoisie over the international. So that's a good introduction to that section. If you want to go ahead and do you want to respond to all of that, and then you can go on to the next, the first section?
Well,
or the 14th.
What was read out there actually does flow into the next section here, which I was going to talk about, section 14 of the history of the three internationals. Between the first and second internationals, it was correctly pointed out, there was a massive growth in labour organisation, aka trade unions, be it in Britain, Europe, America, and even here too. Although Australia was at the time 6 self-governing colonies, there was massive growth in unions, and especially with out of the traditional trades, example the unskilled and semi-skilled. And through that period, there was some in the 1880s. Just before I go on to the next part of it, in the 1880s, actually, then it was actually described as a working man's paradise, and that was the individual who came across that. But that was well over the forerunners of some of the unions. So come to the Australian colonies, working man's paradise. And it implies into the 1890s when we had the first financial or systemic crisis. No, I'll stand corrected. There wasn't the first time capitalism was in crisis, but it certainly was a capitalist crisis in the early 1890s. And there was a lot of huge industrial strikes or labour strikes, predominantly among shearers and rural workers, maritime workers, and even miners as well. A lot of it was actually over the fight over between unionised labour and non-union. It was then known as free labour. And yeah, it obviously the union contract, there were slashes in wages and conditions back then as well. But it was a forerunner of many things. And in that time, in Australia here, there was the formation of the early labour federations, which actually eventually formed, all those can form the Australian Labor Party, and also the Trades Hall Councils, which, for those of you in the US, understand what we mean by Trades Hall Council, or Union Hall, or a Union Council. force formed predominantly here in Victoria. The first ones was Melbourne and Ballarat and Bendigo, where I live, in the 1880s, and then obviously it flowed everywhere else as well, all around the various colonies at the time in Australia. So you had that movement here, and there was a push too to actually form a nation. It basically federate as a nation, which came into being in 1901. On the 1st of January 1901, we federated as a nation then. New Zealand shortly followed a few years later in 1905. And so that was only mainly though to administer British capital. Wasn't there actually as an independent nation yet, but that form of independence, sort of the mindset on here, people here in this country, was certainly the roots were actually strongly embedded in the labour movement. And I know Caleb actually mentioned this before about the song Waltzing Matilda. Now, a little bit of history there. You might have heard it, and those of you overseas are not familiar with it, I won't sing it. I won't subject anyone to my singing. So if we want an audience, well, I will not sing. But it's the history of that. The song was originally an old Scottish ballad, and I think it was Mary McPherson and Banjo Patterson both co-wrote it, and it was actually around the Great Shearers' Strike back then, and actually it was about an early union organiser. Now, organisers were very few and far between in those days, but a lot of them were known as swagmen. They worked pretty much, it wasn't a paid position, but it was recognised amongst workers, and they helped organise the workers there in the regional areas. And by then, you used to go mainly on foot, if you're lucky to get a horse, good on you, because as I said, transport into the areas was pretty much next to nothing. And that's what the story about. And it was actually out of the Great Shearers' Strike of the 1890s where that song originated. And where for mine, I think it was a lot of sentiment to actually eventually have that as a national anthem that never eventuated. Even till this day, you can say it's an unofficial one, but that's where the strong movement had out of the labour movements of the 1890s and 1880s. That strong form of our own eating our own way. So it's quite a rich history and interesting bond doing that, and where our country's heading now. And the other thing I think it's folks looking at number 14. I think what chapter 14 here. I think there's actually we've got to remember too what was created back then was Marx's great work Capital. Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and it was finished off by Engels, obviously. Marx died, I think, passed away in 14th of March, 1883. And by then it was certainly a big loss to the labour movement or international labour movement. It was such a big contribution. And for those of us in Australia too, in Capital, Marx actually referred to one of the self-governing colonies at the time, the Swan River Colony, which is now Western Australia, the state of Western Australia. He actually referred to it, and that book was an opening to it. And so there is that sort of connection at that time. The Marxist influence on the labour movement at the time was very limited. To understand, geographically, Australia is an island nation, very far away from Europe and America, and that. So the information and literature and that was limited up to. But they were socialists. They were known involved in the movement, and obviously forming the various socialist groupings. Some formed the Labor Party, but others still stayed independent. And eventually, went on to form the Communist Party of Australia, which I'll talk about. We'll talk about on a later one when we're talking about the Third International. So it was some of those rich histories back then, and it was also too more of a stable time of imperialism for at least 30 years prior to the first imperial war between Russia and Japan in 1905, I think it was. And it's something worthwhile, but it was actually relatively good relations between the imperial powers. More so on the surface, there's a lot of underlying things, and Germany was late to the table, but they were a growing power as well. And when we were reading through that, the role of the Second International obviously led to the biggest, not say error, but the biggest catastrophe at that time, leading into World War One. Those parties that supported it, so we'll continue on with that. So you can even see the development of the labour movement at that time. You can obviously see what was happening in Europe too with the Gotha Compromise, which Marx and Engels really criticised. Completely criticised thoroughly, and I would actually recommend the book, the Gotha Program, the criticism of it, and obviously through to Marx's death of that time, and then the founding of the Congress in 1889. a few years afterwards. But understand it's a real time of growth and stability in a certain sense, and trade union growth. It obviously things are going to start to come to a head in about 1889 and obviously 1890 with the capitalist crisis. So I'll hand it to you, Dustin.
A few sections a few points I thought were interested in 14. Again, socialists were blamed for assassination attempts in the Kaiser. Beckoning today of blaming Black Lives Matter on Antifa, when it's really the material conditions that are causing these changes. Marx's critique of the Gotha program against no iron law of wages, and that's still used today to put down the fight for 15, the idea that we shouldn't organize, that it's only impossible, defeatism. It comes from a petty bourgeois right deviation. People with their class that are in a good class position don't have the stomach to fight for the working class. That's why working class activists like me and David here need to be involved in socialist understanding and social movements. Marx died. There's some very touching quotes from Engels about the giant of a man that Marx was for his understanding. A lot of the terms we use today, we act like they're set in stone, written terms that have always existed. They're just natural laws of nature. Marx was like the Isaac Newton of social understanding. Like he developed these things, and it's amazing. And his name and his works will endure through the ages. Going on into the next section, section 15, the founding of the Second International, 1889. In Paris, July 14th, 1889, on the 100th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. And they had banners everywhere saying this is the continuation of the fall of the Bastille. It's interesting. Early events in history have always been come up and named. Like we're following this legacy. Like the Zapatistas and the Sandinistas in Latin America, working off of old ideas for the current struggle. It was basically a reconstitution of the First International on a broader basis, and there was more because of the development of capitalism. The development of labor unions was more, and there was more participation. The work of the Congress, growing labor movement, socialist parties, abolition. There was a push for the abolition of standing armies and arming the people, which is an interesting demand, given how this all ends in a betrayal, essentially, when the socialist parties backed World War I. But we'll get into that later. The fight for the 8-hour workday, and also a major part of this, I always thought that the May Day purely originated in the United States, and it did partially with the Haymarket riots, but May Day was actually commissioned by the Second International as a day of demonstrations. International labor demonstrations for the 8-hour day was decided upon by the Second International in this founding Second International session on July 14th of 1889. The Marxist orientation of the Congress. Marxism became the dominant trend. A lot of the figures from the First International, which were still around and played some issues, the Blanquists, the Prohoundists, the Lassalans, the Balkanist anarchists, they started to fade into the background. Um, with the growing of labor unions and workers having more, there wasn't as much need for left adventurism, because the workers, they had a more stable material basis, and they were less attracted to those trends. The scientific socialism, it's the material conditions that governs what the fight back's going to be. Um, there was emergence of Karl Kautsky of Germany, opportunists, who didn't adequately push for political power or of the republic and democratic rights or the dictatorship of the proletariat. He was more of a opportunist, unionist. And it was relatively a period, as Comrade Fox said, of calm capitalist development. There was a growing right danger from a group of folks named the Possibilists, who relied too much on legalistic means. And there was also, in the Second International, there was they had a fault of no real internal leading committee. It was kind of a loose associations of different trade unions and parties, and there was no center leading coordinating body. It didn't really have the teeth it needed, which we'll show later on. The origins of the right opportunists. Skilled trade unions developed antagonists to the larger masses of so-called unskilled workers. Petty bourgeois intellectuals looking for careers in government and leadership. They also formed the class character of it and led the Second International in a more right opportunist direction. Then you had Fabianism, which was harmless to the capitalists. They wanted to work with the capitalists, most likely to maintain their opportunist class position. And another anti-Marxist from the U.S., Gompers, and other anti-socialists. And there was stronger ties to Marxism in Germany at the onset in the first conference. Any reply to the 15th section?
Yeah, look, with what's said, and actually flowing on part 16, and we can actually relate what was happening then here too in Australia as well. I mean, a lot of the unions here, we adopted the British model of trade unionism. It said unskilled, semi-skilled were also in the later parts of the 19th century were organised. And they led some of the great strikes back then as well. With the rise of right opportunism, that actually came about because there was more and more working class people coming into being. Unions were growing, and for someone like Bernstein and even Kautsky, the mindset behind them were, well, instead of revolution, evolution. Capitalism will just evolve into socialism, and all we need to do is just elect our people into parliament, and get control that way, and put all that legislation in place and gradual reforms, and it'll eventually be socialist. And there's no need for any conflict or violent revolution. And that was a mindset for many years, well into the 20th century. And what we've also understand is where the formation of the Australian Labor Party was. There was a massive struggle in that, what sort of party would be. And it basically became a parliamentary party. There's make reforms, but hold capitalism in. In Australia at that time, capitalism was still quite young. The 6 self-governing colonies were coming out as semi-feudal, military top brass rule, basically, out of the penal colony. You had a landed squattocracy or landed gentry. It's a term we use here, squattocracy. Those families that had stole land. Actually, I'll say it was stolen off the original people here. Had vast estates and wealth, and so that's pretty much who ran the show for a long time. But as industry started to develop, you can see the early years. So revolutionary mood here in Australia wasn't about overthrowing the system and putting in socialism. there's more or less what reforms we can get out, and that actually grew out of all the militant struggles of the 1890s of the union movement here. It was saying, well, we both need not just industrial, but we need political organisation. Yes, of course, workers need political organisation. I think the argument was that. But what type of political organisation they believed is obtaining reforms, and over the term reformism became really important here. Became a big term here in Australia. That's how we describe those who advocate the parliamentary way, the parliamentary struggles, and the reformist. And we only need to change some laws. We'll make the system better. But really, all they were trying to achieve was capitalism with a smiley face. That's basically what they're trying to do, because obviously for actually to have socialism, we need to actually change the economic basis overall defined as that socialist superstructure. But which probably no doubt will go into further detail, but I'll leave it at that because I'll need to continue on with number 16. So, okay, so going on to number 16, and actually talking about the growing right opportunism, this is interesting because I know, and if any other comrades are listening and haven't commented yet, I see Helen's, a nice friend and comrade here, Helen's said hello to both of us. I'll give you an example of going back to May Day. Now, May Day in Australia is not celebrated on the 1st of May. Not unless it happens to fall on the first. It's usually for the first Sunday of May, and in Queensland, Northern Territory, it's the first Monday of May. And there was always big arguments. We should always have it on May the 1st. And yes, I think we should. It shouldn't be on the most convenient Sunday of the month. For some people, it should be on May the 1st, so it gives that international one. But what was an interesting part that explained a lot to me, and I just saw that I was on a Zoom meeting one time, and someone was involved in the May Day committee here in Melbourne. And was going, "Oh, we're going to have a Zoom thing for May on the Sunday." And I said, "Why aren't we having on May the 1st?" "Oh, that's so we can get more people and more solidarity and all that." And I said, "Crap!" And I gave him a little bit of a history lesson there. And I was just for those, especially in Australia, and I don't know any other country that does the same. But it goes on the question of International May Day, an issue of prime importance for world workers. The right influence was much in evidence. The German and English opportunists opposed at both the Brussels and Zurich Congresses the basic idea of May 1st, which was to stage a big tools-down demonstration of Labor's growing power and to insist upon the 8-hour day and other current demands. Their line was to shift the May 1st demonstration to the first Sunday in May, which would soften altogether its fighting character. Lenz says, in proportion to the forces at their disposal, the Germans had done less to carry out the May Day decision of the Paris Congress than any other party. Finally, at the Zurich Congress in 1893, the Germans had the manner of May Day celebration left up to the respective parties, which meant they could freely put their own opportunist line into practice. Just that little bit, and they explained a lot just that alone, and now I got it why. And I mean, we need to struggle to put it back on the May the 1st. It's about international solidarity. And as Mark said, workers of all countries unite. We're an international movement. We're not just a national movement. We're not a local movement. We're an international movement. And that shows it, Beja. And once we've moved that into a national movement, it actually will have the ruling class basically shaking in their boots. I won't use the language at the moment, of more colourful language, but I just wanted to put that on there as well and put it out there and help us explain. So if any of socialist, communists, Marxists were looking at the moment, or anyone just generally interested, it really is vitally important we push it to have May the 1st, not just leave it up to every respective country. Oh, we'll just put it on the first Sunday of May so to make it look more respectable for capitalism. No, we're not interested in making ourselves respectable for capitalism. Now, as number 16 continues on, they're talking about the struggle against the war danger. I understand that time, it was after the American Civil War. There was actually a lot of struggle against the English involvement in that, support of the Confederacy, which we've touched base, and no doubt there's been many talks over the last 2 months. Yeah, but there was also other wars happening at the time between the Prussians and the French, and Prussians and the Austrians. But obviously now, the question of war became more important for the working class when it became, obviously, imperialism as it's developing further. It was becoming more aggressive, it was militarising further. Even back then, and circa 1880s, 1890s, they foresaw, basically some foresaw this is going to lead up to a major world conflict. And obviously this was this was put onto the struggle against the war danger as well. And as we go, as we move further through the book and through the chapter, obviously we talk about World War One, but even back then they could see now that everyone was arming. Germany was growing its navy big time. It was huge armaments manufacturing, but so did Britain as well. It had the world's largest navy at the time, and obviously to protect its interests and to expand its interests as well. That obviously things were going to come to a head when you had competing interests militarising sooner or later, and obviously history's proven that quite correct as well. Now the fight of the left, obviously there was a struggle against the right opportunist stream, and obviously you had resolute fighters as Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, and Franz Mehring on one side, and obviously the right opportunists were pretty much represented by Kautsky, Goods, and Plekhanov. And obviously at that time you could see as right opportunism was starting to develop further. When it first started out, it was big, but it wasn't organised. And we're just going to get it, but it started to really get itself seriously organised for that to lead the Second International in the history we've shown through there. Another important thing, and another thing, was the tragic passing of Friedrich Engels on 5th of August 1895. Obviously, he's 75 years old, still a good age at that time as well, but he certainly was a tragic loss for the international working class. Engels, I remember actually Marx really got into detail writing. I think Engels actually quite explained things a little bit easier for working people to understand. Interesting. He was good at doing that. It was he wrote a lot. I like actually sometimes comparing Lenin's writing and Stalin's writing. Lenin was right into the detail and all this, where Stalin just putting things out quite simply for us to understand. And I thought that was it was quite an interesting contrast to that what we see back during Marx and Engels' time. But obviously he wanted to finish off one section of Volume 1 of Capital, and obviously finish off the other respective works of Capital 1 and 2, 2 and 3. Very important books. I just ordered the 3 volumes actually, very new copy. So it certainly is an extensive read, and obviously in the future there'll probably be studies around capital as well. But it was a great loss to us, or a great loss to all the working class at that time. But his contribution to it was just phenomenal, and being Karl Marx's long-term comrade ever since the 1840s in Germany, right up to his passing. And certainly both of them together were a considerable team, and influenced all of us here now and all the future generations to come. So is there anything you want to add on to that?
I thought in this section, reformism versus revolutionary ideology, it was interesting that Marx's revolutionary writings were pushed down. Like what revolutionary stuff that was studied was pushed down and not studied more, or those principles were given like hollow language too, without actually adopting. That revolutionary socialist understanding of Marx was downgraded. The social conditions, the opportunities of the Union suppressed revolutionary thought and understanding. We're having quite a good turnout in the comments. We have a lot to get through. I'm not sure if we want to address these periodically. I mean, this is one of the benefits of doing this live. I guess before I go in the next session, I'll just briefly get these, and then maybe at the start of each section, you could decide which one of these you want to go through.
Yep.
I'll go ahead and address a few of them now, and then when you start your next section, you can address those that were given during my presentation. Martin Zier says social democratic parties, not unions, represented the working class in the Second International, and I believe that's true. I believe that okay. Edist, one reason for the failure of the left wing within the SPD was it did not understand that Germany was not a purely bourgeois state, but it's entirely in which the Persian land gentry still dominated. So not understanding, probably out of an opportunist class position,
Mm.
who the forces they were working with. Uh, and then I think I'll skip the middle Okay, the middle comment. To this end, it would have been necessary for revolutionary proletariat to win over the oppressed Prussian peasantry, carry out a democratic revolution. The democratic revolution could have prepared the ground for a socialist revolution, and that is what happened in Russia later on. So that's perfectly plausible.
Mm.
So I'm going into, you just did the 16th section. I'll go into the
Yeah.
17th section. I'm actually because the time period's right, and I usually try to sing at least one verse or two whenever I do a public announcement. So I'm going to sing two verses from the Union song "Solidarity Forever," which was written in 1915 as an IWW, an industrial workers song. I guess I'll do two verses and then I'll do a chorus line. And on the chorus line, people at home can help and sing along. So I'll go ahead and start that. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshop, endless miles the railroad laid. Yet we stand outcast and starving, miss the wonders we have made. But the Union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong.
Woo! Mm. Thank you. I'm actually glad, comrade, you've actually sang that, because you've actually saved that song. In Australia here, we've had so many people sing it, and it's actually the wrong people singing it too. I think they don't sing it without any meaning. And when we had a former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, who he was one who was instrumental of weakening the working class here in Australia. I won't get into the whole history of him at the moment, but before he passed away, yeah, they did this documentary and he sang it and sounded horrible, just like totally destroyed it. But thank you. Historical moment. And comrade, you've saved that song. I loved it. And you should have.
Okay, the next section, 17, is actually international trade unions, which is the various tendencies within the international union movement. And I figured I'd sing that. And that one came from the tendency of the IWW, the international workers, which actually were somewhat left opportunists in some ways, because they were constantly wanting to fight and not form contracts and stability for the people, which is the opposite of the main problem in this time period, which was opportunism, right opportunism. So one of the first tendency was pure and simple trade unionism. Lenin called this econism. No politics in the union was their slogan, which roughly meant no working class politics, because politics is everything. When someone says no politics, it's usually a specific type of politics they don't want to hear. You notice that in a lot of groups. You say, "Well, don't get political, don't get political," but in these meetings and settings, what it means to be not political is just to go along with the bourgeois politics of that time, and that's what some of the pure and simple trade unionists did. And it was subject to right opportunism. Strasser and Gompers quote, "We have no ultimate aims. We're going on from day to day. We are fighting only for immediate objectives that can be realized in a year. We want to dress better and to live better and to become better citizens generally." And these are all great demands. But if what happens is you don't move forward as a working class. You just are a balance on the bourgeoisie. You're just to stop the most inhumanes of theft and persecution of the working class. It lacked a revolutionary vision, and very a horrible part in this, specifically in the United States. Unions, opportunistic trade unions in the U.S. Barred black workers from joining. They were anti-Marxists, um, and this had a lot to do with the labor aristocracy and the role of imperialism in Britain to a bigger extent in the beginning of this period, but later on the U.S. becomes the dominant imperialist power. And this was true. And there was this trend was true, and forces amongst the opportunist union movement in New Zealand and Australia. Imperialism and racism, along with a contempt for the lower classes, a general great national chauvinism, was prevalent, and it's sad.
Hmm.
And then the next section was the Marxist trade union tendency, which was the Social Democrats. The pure and simple trade unionists would get along with the more bourgeois liberal parties. The trade unionists were supportive of the socialists or social democrats at the time, mostly outside of the U.S. and England, because U.S. and England had more of a labor aristocracy, particularly the German unions. But they also eventually, the so-called Marxist tendencies eventually also grew right wing, and they also tried to get rid of May Day or weaken May Day, as you said, having it on the Sunday instead of on May 1st. And it's interesting. I wanted to respond to your comment earlier. That it's a really practical application of organizing. Do we have the power to stick it to them? Can we let them know our power, or should we acquiesce to whatever they want to say? And just, I think, supporting May Day and if we could build the power to do so as the movement grows. I know in the U.S. With the McCarthy era, we've really been put down. There's only a few socialist organizations that are growing. We can only do so much, so I can understand small groups doing May Day on a Sunday. But as we grow bigger and get more power, not to the point where we take over the state, which was actually what the right opportunist argued. The right opportunist argued we don't have enough power to have a struggle on that day. But they did compared to how weak union movements and socialist movements are in the United States today. They were like vast portions of the population. They could have easily done a May Day strike, which you're having issues. But to build this power and have it every year, just to let them know, hey, we're in charge. You need us. You don't, the old the bosses need to work.
We don't need them.
Yeah. Let's see. So the next trend was anarcho-syndicalism, and a lot of this had to do with there was lingering anarchist tendencies, the Proudhonist, the Balkanism. This is also the song "The Industrial Workers," who are always wanting to fight and not let the workers rest and regroup and build. They had lack of organization to build power. A lot of these folks in France, coming out of the French Commune. And there was also a trend towards a trade union international. There was this thought of having a separate union international, that would promote cooperations amongst different unions outside the Second International. This idea was pushed down by opportunistic forces in the Social Democrats because they were worried that this body could get outside their control. So it was ultimately suppressed. Any response to that section 17, or continued comments? Or
Well, it actually, before going to 18, yeah, I think it was interesting those three trends in the union movement that was coming about, and I mean, obviously, that was a reflection of the struggle of the Second International, I mean, mainly between the left and the right trends of the Second International at that time. And it's interesting, in Australia, even to this day, I'll give you an classic example where there are those who think, basically unions shouldn't be involved in politics at all. It's just merely just the wages and conditions. It still happens to this day. There's also a discussion too about being affiliated to a party in Australia. Most of the unions, not all of them, affiliated to the Australian Labor Party. Now, I won't get into the whole discussion about that, but that's a continual argument about being affiliated to a party the earlier part of the 20th century here in Australia, also too, we had the IWW, which was actually very big here in Australia, especially in regional areas like New South Wales and Queensland, predominantly in mining, but also bush and labouring jobs. But actually, that's how some workers used to just carry an IWW card or ticket with them. That's the only identification they ever had. So if they ever passed away, that's what they were buried with, their ticket. But their attitude was, well, we can change society through one big union, and we're just going to need to sit down, do a big strike, and then we change through there. There's a lot more history to that behind there as well, with the influence of anarcho-syndicalism, but it was good to see how the roots go back to where it was predominantly in Latin America and France and Spain, etc. Just continuing on with, before going on, I just want to respond to Martin's response. Look, you are right with that first comment. Yes, the Social Democratic parties were the main ones representing the working class in the Second International. Because there's a lot to go through, we could be here forever and day going right down to that absolute detail with these chapters. So I do apologise we missed that point. Yes, you are right there. And you also mentioned the link provides information on the national and colonial question within the Second International. There were struggles around the issue. Yes, there was. Obviously, with what comrades, those of you watching and making comments, look, we are trying to get through some of this, so we will try and cover some of the points that we've been missed. And if we happen to miss them, make it just point there. We can try and address them, but we just got to think of time and that. Otherwise, we'll be here for hours and hours on end. Now, with the number 18, Imperialism and Millerand in Paris. Obviously, now the 5th Congress of the Second International met in Paris in September of 1900. Now the imperialist epoch of capitalism had well begun. As Marx had long before indicated, world capitalism, evolving from its early stage of competition, had become increasingly monopolist and eventually imperialist. The period of 1870 to 1900 was a period of transition to imperialism. Lenin says that for Europe, the time when the new capitalism definitely superseded the old can be established with fair precision. It was the beginning of the 20th century. In his great book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, written in 1916, Lenin calls imperialism the monopoly stage of capitalism, the epoch of finance capital. He analysed it as including the following 5 features. And I'll just read the following 5 features because it's very important to understand it. 1, the concentration of production and capital developed up such a high stage that it created monopolies with play a decisive role in economic life. 2, the merging of bank capital and industrial capital and the creation on the basis of this finance capital of a financial oligarchy. 3, the export of capital, which has become extremely important as distinguished from the export of commodities. 4, the formation of the international capitalist monopolies, which share the world among themselves. And 5, the territorial division of the world by the greatest capitalist powers is completed. Now, it was around Lenin's time when all that was coming into being. It was spot on there. Obviously, now we're in a different. Obviously, now the world today. We've got very much the US, the last of the big imperial powers. It's now the fight over the diminishing rate of returns and falling profits of what we see, because now capitalism through free trade agreements, that just seems to flow everywhere now. So, and as one comrade, Caleb Morpin, said, we're in the area accumulation through destruction. We're seeing it. So imperialism is coming to its final conclusion. It's point two from that time. Obviously, the continual strike between. The continual struggle between right and left in the Second International was certainly coming to head around that turn of the 19th, 20th century. We have a look through the Miller and case. During this period, a capitalist upswing and growing imperialism, right opportunism grew in the socialist parties of the chief capitalist countries throughout the Second International. This evil development came to a head at the Paris Congress in 1900 in the celebrated areas of cases of Alexandra Millerand in France and Edward Bernstein in Germany. The fights around these two opportunists, the first, I'll put my glasses on. That's better. The first real international struggles between the right and the left in the Second International shook the organisation from one end of it to the other and threatened to split the movement. So obviously, this is where it was coming in. I'll just read that little opening, the paragraph to the Miller and case, and. I think actually too, we look at what the roots to understand what right opportunism, where it came from, and all that, and read through this book about how that came into being. It just didn't happen like these people were one day Marxists, went to bed that evening and woke up the next morning. They're right opportunists. No, it didn't work that way as well. What they came out for a series of how capitalism and imperialism was developing at the time. Now Bernstein, regarding himself, he actually taken up the term revisionism or revisionist, where he wanted to revise all Marxist and Engels works, and basically said we don't need to have revolution, we can just evolve capitalism into socialism. Look, and like I've just said just a little bit earlier there, he said, look, we can just do this through peaceful parliamentary means. That's all we need to do. Just bump them into Parliament on election day. And all will be well. We'll have heaven on earth, and that was the mindset at that time for the right opportunists. They didn't, as I said, they just didn't go to bed one night and then wake up the next day completely like that. That took its own. It was the material conditions that were actually creating this mindset at the time. And obviously, it was you could see between the two camps, and we look at the struggle against Millerand and also Bernstein, etc. The left was defeated in the Paris Congress. And I'll just read out this little bit here for the further reading. Please get this book and read it further, because the Millerand case occupied the centre of attention at the 1900 Congress of the Second International. The Congress had just passed a resolution limiting the possibilities of coalition with the bourgeois parties. In this discussion, specifically around the Millerand case, three well-defined positions developed. The first, expressed in the Guest resolution, condemned Millerand's action in principle, say that the progress allows the proletariat to take part in bourgeois governments only in the form of winning seats on its own strength and on the basis of the class struggle, and it forbids any participation whatever of socialist and bourgeois governments, towards which socialists must take up an attitude of unbending opposition. Gett's position was strongly supported by Valiant and Rosa Luxemburg, the latter stating that in bourgeois society, social democracy, by its very nature, has to play the part of an opposition party. It can only come forward as the governing party on the ruins of the bourgeois state. And he goes, the second point of view, that the extreme right was represented by Juris with his customary eloquence. Like Guest, Juris also raised the matter as a question of principle, but from the opposite direction. He actively defended socialist party coalitions with bourgeois parties, and he specifically endorsed the individual action of Millerand in entering the French cabinet. Juris declared that by this action they have saved the Republic, and he pictured such a participation in capitalist governments as the beginning of the socialist revolution. And then the third point of view, centrist, was presented by Kautsky. He wrote a resolution known as the Kartosh-Rubbers resolution. Sorry, I'm having trouble presenting some of these words. I'm wrong in language, it's English, and I do have trouble pronouncing other words, which took the opposition that the question and the issue was not one of principle but of tactics. And he said, the Congress does not have to decide upon it, after thus leaving the door wide open for such opportunistic manoeuvres as that of Millerand. The Kautsky resolution proceeded to criticise any socialist who becomes a minister independently of his party, or whenever he ceases to be a delegate of that party. In such a case, he should resign. So there was a bit of fight about that, but the right actually ran out on that as well. So that's why some of those who call themselves socialists were forming coalition with bourgeois parties as well in their countries at the time. Did you want anything to add on to that?
On the 18th section, no, you covered that very well and extensively. You actually covered part of the next section
Yeah,
um, for me. I
yeah,
guess
yeah.
I'll read the one comment that's come up since then from Etatist. Can national syndicalism be called the anarcho-syndicalism of the imperialist period? And I think that's an interesting question because there is a link between right opportunism and left opportunism. Usually, anarchists do not form. Um, they tend to be focused on individual interests, and they do not form powerful organizations that can stand up against imperialism. To this day, some anarchist groups are more angry about Lenin, who died years ago, than U.S. imperialism.
Mm,
They'll go to anti-war protests and say Lenin was horrible.
mm,
Um, the enemy is U.S. imperialism is literally keeping us down, keeping our wages down, and mass murdering people all over the world. And you
mm,
got anarchists on the street defying Lenin, trying to come up with stuff, bring up old battles from years ago. The people
mm.
don't even exist.
Yeah,
Just to prove an individualistic, moralistic point.
mm. Just on
So I
that,
really like
those that criticise Lenin actually from the anarchist point of view, not to say every anarchist does that, but the ones that do. I've actually come across that and I've asked them the question, actually, have you read Lenin's works? And they go, oh, and have you actually read his works? And then they come up with these ridiculous arguments. I'll say, well, one, you've never read his works. Two, you haven't met the man anyway. He's long passed away many years ago. And three, you're just coming up with spurious arguments with no basis at all. I mean, one thing it's going to do, if you're going to come up with an opposition to someone, you need to study their works. It's just unbelievable the amount of people want to argue against something they've never read it, they've never heard of it. They just said to go against it. Well, that's the trend. We'll just go along with it without thinking. And I'm just thinking, do you guys have a brain cell in that head that's actively working? Frustrating.
All right. Just to any anarchist watching, this is not a direct attack on you,
No, not
but
all.
but but but
Without,
tendencies within it. There's a lot of great working class, strong fighting anarchists that we would gladly stand in the streets with. Um, that are doing great stuff. So I'll go on to the 19 Bernstein Revisionism, Amsterdam 1904. You basically started this section. Edward Bernstein believed capitalism will eventually lead into socialism. Revision, he called it revisionism. He called it evolutionary socialism. If you notice, to this day, if you tell people we need a revolution, we need a socialist revolution, like calm down, man, you're going too far. Why can't we evolve? Like that's still a middle class petty bourgeois line. Evolution versus revolution, and the material conditions dictate, and the oppressive bourgeoisie state dictate the revolution is necessary. Um, Imperialism and colonization led to this Bernstein's revisionist position. Lenin repudiated Bernstein. Uh, Reminds me of the Black Agenda report criticizing Democrats, both corporate and Bernie. So I mean, Bernstein, which has a lot like Bernstein's. Um, I think Caleb Moplin paraphrases this quote from the book a lot. Bernstein was into, which is the quote: "The final aim of socialism meant nothing. The day-to-day movement meant everything." Meaning the movement is everything and the goal is nothing, which is the opportunist Bernie and some activist groups and socialist groups in the United States, the protest cage, the PSL, workers. Well, I mean, they're doing some good group, but to be constantly stuck in the movement and not try to break out of that and push forward and organize and get to the masses and build. Um, is a tendency. And then, like I said, this is also a tendency within the Democrats, both corporate Democrats and Bernie Sanders and the squad. They try to get through reforms. They want unity with the party, and that usually just means forget working class issues and go with the bourgeois agenda, and maybe they'll get to us later. And I think Black Agenda Report here in the United States, Margaret Kimberly, Jamu Baraka has some of the clearest scientific understanding and criticisms of the Democratic Party. This was criticized by Rosa Luxemburg. Also, there was this Keynesian. This is the beginnings of later on Keynesian progressive capitalism is similar to Bernstein. There was a fight in the German party. Kautsky, who later became revisionist, who later became opportunist, actually fought against Bernstein. It was so obvious that Bernstein was at fault, was wrong. His ideas were rejected in Germany. But these Bernstein ideas are what really ultimately led to the Second International's downfall. There was an international struggle against revisionism. Like I said earlier, a dangerous fetishization of party unity. Usually, like when the Democrats say party unity as an attack at Sanders, what they're really saying is, let's acquiesce to the plans of the bourgeoisie. The working people don't need health care. The working people don't need their demands met. That's the emphasis on party unity. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks formed. And the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs formed in the United States as a breakoff from the Socialist Labor Party. And there was also problems with white chauvinism in the American Socialist Party. American Socialist Party did not do enough to organize against the brutal repression and lynchings of the African American people. This is another instance of class reductionism, where through racism or material conditions or opportunism, we don't address and stand in solidarity with oppressed and colonized people. And oppressed and colonized people, in the interest of solidarity, an injury to one is an injury to all. So the oppression of the African American people brings down the wages of the entire working class. And the opportunist forces, bourgeois forces, in the union movement and the Socialist Party didn't adequately recognize this. And even they expressed some of these reactionary sentiments to the larger ISB, the international body, and they didn't accurately respond. And you can see some of this in today's white leftist parties, where they'll meet in like I had this even as a working class person trying to get into socialism, and you see this petty bourgeois socialist forces, more of the students and more petty bourgeois and technocrat intellectuals will meet in fancy restaurants or show up late and do stuff that's just outright repulsive to a working person. He has to get up the next day. Or they'll ask working people to go across town, and our cars are broken down. We ain't got the gas money, and they're not, and this is even worse for colonized people or people of color, who are in worse circumstances. A lot of these petty bourgeois, specifically the organization I met with, the ISO, which was largely petty bourgeois, was not accommodating to working class people or people of color. And they need to work on that. And I think the growing mass, the conditions change, the weakening of the labor aristocracy, the growing masses of the unemployed, hopefully this will change. There's more call than ever for solidarity and to build a bigger, better socialist movement in this country that has the possibility of changing things. Left carries the Amsterdam Congress resolutions calling for the out of Bernstein. Many abstain, and this is showing you that there was forces, even though Bernstein was rejected or kicked out. Some of these abstaining votes later continue this very negative trend. Anything to add to that section?
Well, really, I think you've covered a fair bit of that, and I think it's something that's good when you mentioned about white chauvinism, in that particular section of it. Little thing that was happening here in Australia at the time, at the turn of the 20th century there, early 20th century, I mean, well, it was obviously, I think the first Labor government was formed, I think in the first decade of the 1900s. The later part, but there was a policy put in place in the first term of government. It was called the White Australia Policy. If any of your comrades hear it, the White Australia Policy. That was put in because basically it was, they wanted to turn as Australia the Britain of the South. There was a lot of racism involved there. Actually, some of the early platforms of some of the Labor movement, or Labor parties, they wanted to form. One was there to oppose any Chinese-made goods, not made in China, but the Chinese people living in Australia making goods. There was opposition to it to look after the white workers. So yes, it had it here as well. But a disgraceful period, and of course our Indigenous people, our worst people, they were treated appallingly. They weren't treated as citizens or human beings. They were looked at as part of the fauna and flora, as I say, as a subspecies. And yes, and two, actually, just back a little bit of a step back, Australia had slavery as well. And both not only just an Indigenous, but we also a lot of Pacific Islanders that worked in the cane fields in northern Queensland. They're known as the Kanaks. And obviously, when this White Australia policy came through, they was then put on a ship, no wages, weren't given any compensation, no wages, nothing. Sent back to their respective Pacific nations. So it obviously had that chauvinism had a racist undertone to it as well. Disgraceful period. It's nothing to not going to hold our heads up high about, but that was our thinking at the time. Just Martin actually made a comment about the any imperialist left in the contemporary colonial world did the dissolution of the Soviet Union and anti-imperialism as an international strategy. Well, that's what the USSR was deliberately dismantled. Let's face it, it was done deliberately and intentionally as well. I won't go into the whole complete thing of that, but it did end anti-imperialism as an international strategy. Not quite. I think anti-imperialism did take it was a big blow to it. And everything else for that time, but obviously moving forward, I think it's actually moving forward again. I think what happened over 20 years ago, some big lessons to be learnt. 30 years ago. From that, it was certainly a very dark period for the whole international movement. But I think moving forward, it's picked itself up again, especially now as systematic crisis of capitalism just worsens out there now. Capitalism is no longer able to provide a move a pathway forward. I think it's, but we do need to come up with a proper international strategy. That's why even like what forums like we're doing now is part of that as well, part of the study. Hopefully I'll try to answer that for you, Martin. Obviously, as I said, we've only limited with time. So I'm going on to number 20, Lenin, the party of a new type. Now that's exciting. Going into Lenin, the man himself. Look, I mean, Lenin was unknown in Australia until after the Russian Revolution, more or less. I mean, there were a few socialists. Communists might have had some correspondence, but I'm not aware of it at the time with them. Now, with the growing right, and it was happening in Europe, well, at the time, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, which came known as the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, it was a party made up of Marxists, but also other trends as well in there. Basically, it was like what Lenin wanted to come about after the struggles of the party of a new type was a party based on democratic centralism, where unlike with some in that current Russian party at the time, just wanted to have a party. If you can join on a few agreed principles, where what Lenin was talking about, a party in new time, was a very strong and disciplined party as well. Because all it's saying is, revolution's not a dinner party, and it's something to be seriously done. And what it means is it is democratic. Everyone participates in all levels of the party, discussions on policy, way forward. But once the decision's made by the majority, then the decision must be held up, and you continue on in party unity. And I think. I think it's right. That was an important development because it's also set the first foundations of the early for the Communist parties later developed on at the end of World War One, and obviously set that model up for it, and it was vitally important. Now, Lenin was obviously born in 1870. Well, obviously, he was born in 1870. Died and passed away in 1924. He was born on April 10th, 1870, in Simbirsk, Russia. And his father was a birth peasant. He became a school teacher, and his mother was also of modest origin. His older brother Alexander, one of the most active organisers of the Narodnaya Volya, People's Will, a terrorist organisation, was hanged by the Tsar's government in 1887. The same year, Lenin entered the Kazan University of St. Petersburg and Moscow, being barred against him as the brother of an executed revolutionary. And just keeping that, when I said it was a terrorist organisation, the amount of when governments all in the Western countries of Europe and America, but even down here in the global south, like for Australia, is it's just how easily they can just turn on classes as a terrorist organisation. So it sounds like capitalism's very quite worried, and so they'll try and use everything means to crush any forms of opposition to it. Obviously, building a revolutionary program forward. Lenin collided with the revisionists on all major points when he first got involved in the Second International, and even amongst his own party or his own country as well at the time. And it explains how, and you actually look at Lenin's work, when you read it, you can just see he's got all extensive, he's collected and selected works and various sections on just his struggles against the revisionists and other opportunists in it at the time. On this basis and practicing many great writings proceeded to establish the whole body of Marxian theory. And I think what Lenin's role in all this, he developed Marxist theory to a higher level during the era of imperialism as well. So he was pretty much, he was the right person at the right time, I think, and came in at the right moment as well. He certainly, there was a lot of rich history there, the development of what happened with the Paris Commune. And obviously, obviously another part about the Russian Revolution of 1905. I think that Dust will talk about there as well. This is the early attempt, and I think I can read right through it. But as I said, all I've done and do is just want to read this little bit about the birth of Bolshevism in London in 1903. And it goes: the London Convention, which founded the party, met in the midst of a rising wave of mass struggle in Russia. There was an industrial crisis which largely crippled the industries between 1901 to 3, and there were big strikes in many parts of the country. These strikes constantly become broader and more revolutionary in tone, were met with brutal violence from the Tsar's government. During 1902, the movement spread to the peasants, and they set fire to the landlords' mansions and seized their lands. Students also became involved, and militant demonstrations took place in many universities. Russia was building up to the revolution of 1905. Lenin laid solid preparations for the construction of the party in London. He led it in the establishment of the journal Iskra. He published his famous book, What Is to Be Done, and he led a broad educational campaign among the various Marxist groups. Already in this preliminary work, Lenin gave a clear picture of the disciplined vanguard party that was to be built. The Congress opened in July the 30th, 1903 in Brussels, but owing to police persecution, it had to move to London. There were 43 delegates representing 26 organisations. And the Iskaris had some 24 solid supporters, and it was Lenin, Plekhanov, Martov, Axelrod, Zoselich, and Trotsky were present. Stalin was not there, being in Siberian exile. The opposition opposed the introduction into the program of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which no other part of the Second International specifically endorsed. They also opposed including the right of self-determination, the formulation of demands for the peasantry. The program had both minimum, immediate, and maximum ultimate demands. Lenin, and with the cooperation of Plekhanov, beat back the opposition, and the revolutionary Iskra program was adopted. So you can even then you see the struggle that was happening in there against the right opportunist trend, which basically was the right opportunist trend, which developed in support which eventually came in to support your own bourgeoisie, accept the rule of permanence of capitalism. We'll just make some mild reforms and everything else, not to have this revolutionary force in here. We'll oppose that as well. And how dare you allow the self-determination of colonial people who have been dominated by colonialism and that. But Lenin was quite refreshing actually for that time. And it was a vital, as I said, it's a vital importance of that coming about. But what you're seeing why that developed was over the material conditions that was happening in Russia at the time. The strikes now, a strike alone, or even a general strike, doesn't necessarily is revolutionary. But what happens? It was mainly a general strikes are usually a list over some key demands out of a capitalist system, but not there to get rid of capitalism. But what happens in Russia? These strikes were more than just demands. They were actually going to higher levels of struggle of ideology and political and ideology to actually change the system overall. And eventually, led to, and this is where we learn the three forms of ideological struggle: is economic, is political, and ideological. From the lower to the higher levels. So what we're seeing is from lower levels of struggle, the higher levels of struggle, things in quantitative to a qualitative change. And it's quite important we keep that in mind. And what we're seeing that's happening in the US at the moment, quantity into quality as well. So these are all things to learn. There could be a big backlash against the Black Lives Matter protests. The Chaz could be horrible things happen to that, but whatever happens, these are lessons to learn. These are all quantitative into qualitative changes as well. It's not like what Bernstein and the rest of all the opportunities. Oh no, just gradual evolution, just gradual changes. We'll make a few mild reforms and things will change and be wonderful overnight. No, this is what Lenin actually set out was actually based on Marxist philosophy. And what we're seeing is matter in motion, things going from lower to higher levels of struggle into lower levels into higher levels of change. So quantity and quality. Did you want to add anything onto that?
Yes, section 20 on Lenin. I got to make a plug. I'm started an audiobook on J.V. Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism. I have the introduction in the first two chapters. I'm working on the third one.
Great.
It will be posted soon. I might end up studying this later. We can talk more about that later. I think you basically covered it. I actually wanted to add a bit of a cultural piece here. I'm going to read a poem by Langston Hughes. This is Lenin by Langston Hughes. Lenin walks around the world. Frontiers cannot bar him. Neither barracks nor barricades impede. Nor does barbed wire scar him. Lenin walks around the world. Black, brown, and white receive him. Language is no barrier. The strangest tongues believe him. Lenin walks around the world. The sun sets like a scar. Between the darkness and the dawn, there rises a red star. That's Comrade Langston Hughes on Lenin. Just how he was admired by people all around the world, including people within the African American nation here in the U.S. And Langston Hughes, which was a tankie, is downplayed in our bourgeois-controlled school system. We do not read that poem in our schools. Langston Hughes is honored, but his appreciation of Lenin is not taught in our school system. I think I'll read some of the comments here. Just briefly, there's a comment by Martin Zier and Etatist praising Lenin for his work on the national questions. And in here it says, workers of the world and oppressed people unite. There's a great sentiment of the solidarity of the working class with the oppressed peoples of the world, the common enemy of the bourgeois, the monopoly capitalists, of the imperialists. Moving on to section 21.
Just before you do it, I just want to make one more comment about section 20. And talking about the vanguard party of the proletariat, there's a couple of points. Now, what we also understand, to be a vanguard party of the proletariat or of the working class, it is born out of struggle. It's not just a matter of people getting together. All right, we formed a new party. We're the vanguard party. We're taking the most pure line. That's an incorrect thing. And for those, there's a lot of parties out there, Australia, America, all around the world. So many of them. It's just becoming a bit ridiculous at times. But there's splits or whatever. And the thing is, when they turn around and say they're the vanguard party, well, actually, no. You're incorrect, because they're not they're not involved in the class struggle, and two, they haven't got the respect of the working class to be the vanguard party either, and they must be directly connected to the class struggle, like what Lenin at the time when he was forming the new party, the new type, and what's to be done. So yeah, and what we understand, the party is born out of the class struggle. It's not actually just come together with some minds. Let's form a vanguard party. So you always keep that in mind. The other part about too, it's actually proven too, was the working class, the revolutionary class. And actually, when you showed the foundations of Leninism and Stalin, he clearly pointed out it's a class that's coming into being, and the capitalist class is going out of being. So it's what we're seeing is there, and that's why we side with what's coming into being, and that is the working class. It's a lot bigger, more people being pushed into its ranks a lot. That's what improves. And basically, the working class doesn't need the capitalist class. It can perfectly run the system run things for themselves as a class, and not because they are classes, because they can do it in a totally different economic system, which we call socialism. So, anyway, sorry about that. I'll just had to jump and pipe in and raise that point.
Okay, continue on the 21st section. Let me get caught up with the book so I can tell folks out there that are paying attention. This is page 150 in this edition. The Russian Revolution of 1905. There was a Russo-Japanese war, which ultimately was a defeat for Russian imperialism, a weakening of Russian imperialism. There was a rising revolutionary wave. Starving soldiers sent to their deaths by the group of the czarists and the capitalists together sent regular working people starving into the slaughter. There was major strikes, including Bloody Sunday, where it was led by a religious leader, Gapan, who had a secret who had connections with the secret police, and this was actually warned of by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks warned the people, "Hey, this is a setup. This is a trap," and they went in anyways, and they were fired upon. And it was a massacre. Yep. And the czarist, imperialist, capitalist coalition or whatever, the ruling class at the time, was expecting this to demoralize the people, to stop them from organizing. But it had the opposite effect. There was a massive outpouring after the massacre, just as currently in the United States, the lynching of George Floyd was the constant lynching of African Americans in the United States, is a tactic to demoralize and suppress the movement and the feelings and the people, the African American people and the working class on a whole. But just as this lynching went viral, had the opposite effect, is emboldened people. People out in the streets in mass in every city. It's inspiring. Just this had the similar effect where the Russian czars wanted to suppress the people, and there was an emotional outpouring against the massacre, against the working people, peacefully assembled for just demands. There was both student organizing and oppressed national resistance. There was two tactics, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Menshevists pushed a bourgeois revolution while writing off the peasantry. But the Bolsheviks took demands of the proletariat and pushed to organize the peasantry. Trotsky was vehemently against the peasantry. Kind of the snooty. It's actually very interesting that Trotsky was against the peasantry. And if you look at Trotskyists today in some circles and trends, there's this anti-working class sentiment, an anti-populist sentiment, writing off rural people in general, who it's not the same class character, but there's overlaps. Lenin continues revolution, one revolution into another, led by the proletariat. The proletariat, even though the czarist faction was in power, it was a coalition of the czars and the capitalists. And the proletariat was the biggest growing class. So this enabled, even though not before, maybe in the early bourgeois revolutions in Germany and other places, it couldn't go immediately into a proletarian revolution. But the conditions, the material conditions in Russia were ripe. And because of the size and the power of the proletariat, to go from the bourgeois revolution directly into the proletarian revolution, which Lenin advocated. Peace and insurrection. Mensheviks pushed peace, Lenin pushed insurrection. Different material conditions call for different actions. So there is times, depending on the current conditions, the tactic is the correct tactic isn't the same correct tactic all the time. You can't be like always insurrection, fight. That's not always the correct tactic, or it can't be bourgeois reforms all the time. Depending on the material conditions, is there an opportunity in bourgeois political process to actually get gains? If the answer is no, it's time for insurrection, because that's where the people are going. And when there's opportunity to get gains for the people in bourgeois democracy, then maybe insurrection isn't the best plan of action. And it takes scientific socialism that Lenin was armed with to understand when is the right time for insurrection and when is the time to work within the bourgeois structure for gains for the people. And it is ultimately the choice of the ruling class that decide whether a revolution will be peaceful or violent. Because if a revolution does not come through peaceful means, it will come about violently. And it's their lack of acquiescing to the needs of the people to maintain their own class that determines whether there's a violent or peaceful revolution. High tide of revolution and reaction. Menshevists sided with the Tsar to implement bourgeois reforms after mass strikes, and there was mass strikes and added peasant unrest. 1905 failed after much struggle. There was much struggle, but they scared them, though. It was kind of like the tremors of the coming revolution. This was John Brown's raid before the Civil War. It scared the death out of the slave owning people, and then they succeeded, and then a revolution happened. There was major backlash when the people rose up and there was peasants unrest. It scared them to death, so they came down hard on them, and then eventually, the Russian Revolution takes place. But this was the tremor of the coming earthquake, which was the revolution that shook the world. The question of the political mass strike, opportunists opposed the general strike, call it impossible, while Lenin and the Bolsheviks demonstrated its power in this time period. The mass strike was also supported by Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin. I think that's all I have for this section. Do you have a response?
Look, no, I think you covered it. And I think it's actually about tactics, what sort of tactics you use at any given time, or particular place and time. I mean, look, I've been through my own experience where, we've had a hostile government towards workers' rights, for example. And there's always a call out, let's general strike. Now, the fact is, that's great if the working class was in a position of strength and organisation to do so, to stop any of those media attacks. But if it's not, then how do we get to a general strike? And maybe we'd have to, if the working class is in a weakened position, well, you know, calling for a general strike will just go right over their heads. How do we organise something? It's like a general with no army ordering go charge and fight. Doesn't work that way. And I think we've got to have a look. It's a good question about tactics. What's the correct ones formed? But also too, with the question about tactics, we need to know where we made the mistakes in the past, what worked, what didn't, and what we need to learn and really judge it. It's important as well. I mean, I'll go back to the word term general strike. Just understand too, general strike's not a revolution. Yes, it's a great way. It's a good tool of strength. It's a tool to use, and that's only can be effective if the working class is organised in a position to do so as well. But we need to have a look at that. Also, too, we're going to have a look at other tactics we might want to move forward and how we're going to build up. And the question is, even if the objective was to have a general strike, if the goal was to have a general strike to achieve certain objectives, well, then how do we build up to that as well? And that's what scientific socialism is all about when we look at it, how we're going to organise to get there, not just happen to go call out slogans, a general strike, and, you know, well, we're going to have revolution. Okay, no worries. We're going to have revolution at 12 o'clock tomorrow, weather permitting. And it just doesn't work that way at all, and we've got to have a look at it. Look, I just want to continue on the colonialism and the war from Stuttgart in 1907. Both Martin, is it Itatis, or Itatis? Look, I actually mentioned things on colonialism, and I think it's a good question to learn. And when I'm reading through this about the colonial question, there was a lot of thinking in not every socialist party, mind you, and not every socialist, but a lot of them thought, well, we want our socialism, we want to keep our colonies and have our socialism at the same time. You know, and it was actually too, if you read through this part of the chapter, that's chapter 22 for us. They're talking about, there was even ones that were like, oh no, it was socialism only for white workers. Everyone else can go to hell, basically, attitude. And I did talk about the White Australia policy that was developed in the early 1900s. It actually wasn't completely removed until the Whitlam government of the early 70s actually came in and formed government. They actually got rid of that. So it was quite a part of our long part of our history there. But I think it's obviously about national chauvinism, and you Americans really get picked on about through this book. You call American national chauvinism, but you don't understand too as I said, what was the material conditions that were causing that ideology? National chauvinism, colonialism, and it was imperialism. Imperialism was actually buying off a certain section of the working class in the world. And I know we've heard talks, Caleb Maupin's talked about it, I think we've touched on it as well, but our other comrades around the world is called the Labour aristocracy. What a great way of dividing the working class internationally. What a great tactic on behalf of the bourgeoisie, but buy off a section of it. Isn't that good? You know, yes, we'll provide a lot of things for you, so you can have a home, you can have this, you can have all these good things. We'll provide some education. All right, we'll give you some health and a few other sweetness. And also, they were making gains within under the imperialist system, where the colonial peoples, the ones that were oppressed, like the indigenous of the various countries, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Asia, and all that, were definitely downtrodden. They were brutally oppressed. And during that time, there was actually a lot of anti-colonial struggles here in Australia. Indigenous were forming an anti-colonial struggle. And actually, to this day, you can see a lot of the rallies, and that is still a form of anti-colonial or any form of struggle there as well. No doubt in America as well, Canada, right down through all Latin America there as well. But you look at Africa, there was a massive pushback, and Asia as well. And I'll give you a classic example: China and the Boxer Rebellion in the 1800s, and how they fought. And that rebellion was brutally crushed by British authorities. But what did the workers of various other countries do in Imperial European? And that was, unfortunately, there was a mindset when colonial, anti-colonial struggles were brutally crushed. There was hardly any words spoken about it, or if it was only addressed by those who were proper Marxists, communists, and those ones who are trying to lead an in class struggle. But the Labour aristocracy, which was represented politically through the various parties and also through the unions, very little at the same time. So that's and that was actually a part of part of it, the bourgeoisie used, and you can see where a lot of the racism came from. There's look at all these people are inferior; they're not really that good. It was the white worker that was, all this garbage that was fed the workers. It's actually only quite a short chapter, and I think we've got. I can actually cover a little bit of it, and I'll just say I want to read a couple of little paragraphs here, but it's worthwhile to understand about the colonial question, and Martin said raised it there in the comments. As on the basic questions handled by the Congress was that of the colonies. During the previous 30 years, all the major powers had helped themselves to vast stretches of territory. As we have remarked earlier, they had set up the most atrocious systems of oppression and exploitation among the populations. These powers were now quarrelling ominously over their colonies, and colonialism had become an urgent political question. Notoriously, the right social democrats in all countries either openly or covertly supported or conciliated the colonial policy of their national imperialist bourgeoisies. The trade union bureaucrats also were not slow to observe that the capitalists, to win the acquiescence of organised labour, were not averse to sharing with the skilled labour aristocracy some crumbs of the rich super profits wrung from the colonial peoples. The petty bourgeoisie also shared in the prosperity bred of the looting of the colonies, and the social democratic intellectuals reflected this fact. Despite the occasional protests of Marxists, the labour movement in England was no serious obstacle to the seizure of immense empire by Great Britain during the last half of the 19th century. Most of the top trade union leaders of the period raised no objection to the overrunning of backward lands by the great powers, particularly by their own country. Cole and Postgate say of the Fabians. Many of the Fabians, especially Bernard Shaw, were not without a touch of the imperialist spirit. Shaw, for example, intensely disliked small nations and backward peoples as obstacles to the onward march of civilization, and was inclined to regard the British Empire as a potentially civilizing force. Generally, revisionist social democrats in Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, and other imperialist lands held views akin to Shaw's, although usually they were not so frank in expressing them, nor were some left-wingers entirely free from such illusions. Just so that I read those 2 or 3 paragraphs, because I think it understand how the material conditions and how they came into being. Now, obviously, colonial peoples were just totally atrocious. It was appalling. They weren't just like shot on the spot and executed. They were enslaved, and there was diseases and everything. And even too, drugs like the opium trade was a classic example from out of China. That's why the Boxer Rebellion was crushed. We'll crush the Chinese people and then feed them opium, but it was a rich market to be made out of it. And it was a disaster for the Chinese people at the time, a really big disaster. But it didn't matter because profit reigned. But for those in the imperial countries, it didn't matter because profits reigned. So we'd make more money out of it. And I also, too, just a little bit of mindset. I want to take you back probably about 3 centuries wide to the 1600s when England before it actually formed with Scotland and Wales to form Britain. But it was that time when they started looking at colonising the world, even after the formation of Britain, this British way of doing things. Britain ruled the waves. Britain was, we're going to civilise the savages of the other country. All this mentality was part of it. So it wasn't just happened to come in light in those 30 years of imperialism of the late 1900s. Yes, the late 1800s, the 19th century. This is obviously going back to the last couple of centuries, and that mindset put on, it's British made, it has to be really good. That's made in some other countries not really good. It was the mindset that was put into it, an ideology of our respective bourgeoisies to put into it. And it was actually played a very dominant role here in Australia for such time as well. And as we regard as the Britain down under, and like just all our history, our national anthem for many years, right up to, I believe the 1970s, was God Save the Queen, and we're known as the Queen's subjects or British subjects still. So there you go. It shows that sort of colonial, imperial type of mindset put into it. But I would, did you want to add anything else to that?
I just thought it was interesting. One of your slight jokes was America really gets picked on in this section. And I just wanted to make the point that it's important for scientific socialists not to get caught up in bourgeois emotional appeals to patriotism, to understand that there has been people who have overcome their material conditions and been on the right side of courageous people. Harriet Tubman, John Brown, people like that, who rose up and was on the right side of history. But the masses of people, including ourselves, and revolutionaries like later on, like Maoist anti-war veterans. I mean, the material conditions and the controlling of bourgeois society made them tools for the empire, and there's no way of knowing this, you know. Or that they're just we're all really products of the material conditions, and it's amazing that we're able to break outside of this and understand this with scientific socialism, and free other people from this disease of blind adherence to jingoist patriotism. Just um, quick note on that. There hasn't been any comments. Continue the question, guys, if you want to keep the questions. I'm going to move on to the next section.
Yeah, we'll try and answer the questions as goes along. If we can't get every single one, just forgive us, and we do have to go.
I haven't seen any more since Martin's, and I'm not sure how to answer. I'm not sure who Pravos was. It might be mentioned. Hopefully someone will come later on and reply to that. Let's see. So you finish the 22nd section. I'll go right into 23. Copenhagen Congress 1910. There was a Ray. You just finished the 22nd section, right?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Okay, good. So we're on the 23rd section.
It's on page 165. Yep.
All right, page 165. People following along. Okay. Rise of the danger of war. The Second International put out well wishes to the struggles of the colonized people, but did not offer firm support. It kind of reminds me of the Democrats, who just put out very superficial calls, or even a lot of the bourgeois organizations using Black Lives Matter in their advertising, like their advertising, Google putting celebrating Juneteenth, when they're part of the oppressive class, just like the petty bourgeois labor movement was acting against the interests of its own working class and against the interests of the colonial people, by just giving them well wishings instead of firm support for the struggle. Because of right-wing opportunism and their class position. There was anti-war resolution, was basically spineless legalistic work, no general strike, and the little bit of spineless legalist work wasn't even followed through upon. It's becoming very opportunistic at this point. National trade unionism. There was reactionary nationalism. This is the time period where Stalin developed further on the national question. And one of the poet I recommended earlier, Matt Cedillo, is part of an organization, a media organization called Telejaguar, and they're on Facebook, and they had this very cool meme of like a Chicano version of Stalin, and they call it Jose Stalin, and he was dressed like with the Cortez Nikes, and it was like a regular Chicano vato from the 90s, and it was like Jose Stalin reading the national question. It was a beautiful meme, and it shows like the respect of oppressed nations. It's almost coming full circle. Stalin understanding the role of the oppressed nations, and here this is a media group of an oppressed nation.
Yep.
Recognizing the accomplishments of Stalin through new culture, memes, new technology, reoccurring today. Let's see where I left off. Opportunistic conceptions of cooperatives, fantasies of cooperatives as the end-all measure. I have a lot of respect for Richard Wolff, and I watch his stuff a lot, and he really helps me understand like really what's going on. But I have some worries about his emphasis on cooperatives being the end all. But I mean, but he's also pushing some state power. It might be his position as an academic versus revolutionary working class. What he can say, he might be on our side privately, but his position is so it's a little bit of my concerns with the cooperatives. I think they're great. I think building cooperatives is great, and we need to do that. Caleb Maupin push for that. But there's a danger of that being the end all. You need political power in building to overturn.
Yeah.
Kautsky and Legion. There's a big debate, another squabble, and basically the archetype or the basic premise, overreaching understanding I got from this. A lot of debates are just reflections of class antagonisms. This was a debate between the more government bourgeois forces and the bureaucrats of the Union. It was a struggle between two reactionary opportunistic forces, and they made up this whole drama and dialogue to push their class over the other. And it's very similar to the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. The Democrats representing they're probably more so disgusting forces than these opportunistic forces in the Second International. But the Democrats usually represent the higher managerial capitalists, the oil and banking, and then the Republicans represent the large scale manufacturers, the military industrial complex. And then they build this whole drama like Russiagate or COVID is a hoax somehow. They build these narratives and these dramas that are just a representation of underlying class antagonisms. I think that's an interesting, like, when you read, you're not just reading for the main details, the dates, or the sections. When you read, you're looking for the overall archetypes and the building of history, the recurring patterns. And I really got that out of this text and was able to apply it higher. That's all I have for this section. Any response?
Well, no, I'm going to raise speaking about worker co-ops, or about cooperatives. Cooperatives in Australia actually played a huge role, especially in rural, regional areas. We had a lot of farmer cooperatives, like for dairy, vegetable, fruit, and even food processing, food preserving, and all that packaging, etc. A lot of it were cooperatives set up by farmers and growers, etc. And you had, like, for example, the cooperative bulk store and the cooperative shop and all that. Even like the other companies like there's a cargo bulk handling, which is from Western Australia. It's actually as a cooperative. And you see that they played an important role. When it came to workers' co-ops, there were very few. There's actually an organisation now. We've got Earthworker based out of Melbourne. They do a lot in setting up worker co-ops, and they're having that discussion now to make sure these co-ops just don't become another capitalist enterprise. They want to look beyond that and how we can look at developing economic basis. And you mentioned Professor Richard Wolff before. I watch his stuff. I probably know that you see. I share a lot of his posts up there on Facebook. And very educational. I think what we're going to understand, but worker co-ops alone ain't going to be ones that change the system. Yes, vitally important that we need to set up in our own economic basis, but we need to look beyond that, how we can make our own superstructure and everything else. And I've mentioned this before. You've got an economic base, and out of the economic base determines the superstructure, which will also influence the economic base again. Not the other way around. We change the superstructure and then come up with an economic base. I think it's so. It's an important philosophical discussion and understanding we've got to have as well. But it's quite important. I think the in thinking then at the time was, why don't we just have a cooperative commonwealth? We'll get all these co-ops together and everyone lives in this fantasy utopian land. Doesn't work that way. Obviously, but they played an important role, no doubt, developing in Australia, developing the agricultural industries much more, and even some of the manufacturing side of it and food production, etc. But as I said, they're not the than not just alone, that alone is going to be the answer. So it's an interesting one you put up there, and obviously that was that thinking at the time, and no doubt there's still some that think that to this day. I still come across those and think, oh, we'll just have everyone on cooperatives. Well, we've still got a capital superstructure here. How's that going to work? So we do need to always keep that in mind about our own economic development. Right. Well, oops, I skipped a chapter. Now 24 thickening war clouds. As we're looking at them in Basel in 1912, and obviously back then the early part of the second decade of the 20th century, and obviously there were actually conflicts happening before, and actually obviously there was the Socialist Labour there was a Congress in Copenhagen, set the next World Gathering of Socialist Labour to take place in Vienna in August 1914. This ninth Congress, on the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Second International, had been a very special affair, but the threatening international situation caused a change in plans, because the International Socialist Bureau had to call an extraordinary conference in Basel in November 1912, presumably to adopt measures to protect the interests of the workers and of world peace. And there was obviously tension amongst the imperial powers and their satellites. Europe experienced one crisis after another. In July 1911, Germany and France narrowly escaped a clash over Morocco, when the Kaiser sent a cruiser into Agadir to defend German imperialist interests, known as the Agadir Incident. But the crisis was patched up by a temporary agreement. Then there was the Italian-Turkish War of 1911 over Tripoli. But the special crisis that brought the forces to the Second International together was the outbreak of war among the Balkan states in early October 1912. Turkey, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro were involved. Within 6 months, Turkey was beaten, but in June 1913, the Second Balkan War started, a general struggle among all the Balkan powers, which lasted until August of that year. And originally, those wars did start as national struggles at the Balkans, when Christian peoples, parts of the Turkish Empire, and a break loose from the Mohammed masters, but they immediately took on the aspect of preliminary struggles that will set the basis of World War I. Now, obviously, the idea of forming the Basel Conference and the manifesto was to prevent the spread of the Balkan War and avert an outbreak of the general European conflict at the time. And I just want to add this: the manifesto was basing itself on two famous Lenin-Luxembourg paragraphs of the Stuttgart Resolution, warned of the great danger of the Balkan War leading to a general conflagration. The Congress viewed with satisfaction, however, the complete unanimity among the socialist parties, the trade unions in all countries on the war against war. And over-optimistically, it declared that the fear of the ruling classes that a world war might be followed by a proletarian revolution has proved to be an essential guarantee of peace. Efforts were made at the Congress, as usual, to write in the general strike as the main means against war, but they failed. Now, just on that, I like it. It wasn't a guarantee against peace. Obviously, as the events unfolded in the following 2 years to the first shots fired in World War I, it certainly did that as well. But I think it's what's vitally important as it goes along. There were a lot of words, a lot of, yes, we will oppose it, we want international solidarity, we will do everything possible. But there's a difference between words and on what they do in practice as well. And what we saw then is obviously respective social democrats, socialists, whatever, so were more and more supporting their own bourgeoisie of their own countries during that time. I think in the Balkans there was certainly a lot of ethnic, but it turned into national wars then, certainly. And obviously, there was also an obvious struggle against the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well at the time, which had a good section of the Balkans as well. But really what it was this was going to set the foundations of the First World War. Sorry. What I find, well, there's also too, why we have war. It actually is a reflection of the crisis of capitalism. There is a capitalist crisis of that early part of that decade, and obviously it wasn't like everything was booming. There was a systematic crisis of capitalism, and what does the bourgeoisie do? Was the bourgeoisie being historically done during a crisis of capitalism? Well, look at starting a war. Get production going again, and obviously for whatever reasons, but obviously then to expand their own markets even more, looking to take over other markets. So yeah, we had the 1904, Russian and Japanese War, and then obviously then following on to the latter part of the second decade, all these smaller wars are happening at the same time. The forces, the Second International, goes on the eve of War One. The Second International had affiliated to it. It 27 socialist and Labour parties of 22 countries, with a combined electorate of about 12 million voters. Lawrence lists their strength. Thus, the Social Democratic Party of Germany had about over 1,085,000 members and polled 4,250,000 votes. So by then, it was still quite large. And a lot of mostly European, but even some Australia and New Zealand was mentioned there as well, were affiliated at that time through their respective Labor parties. The opposition to it, it's obviously at the time between words and deeds, but as I said, they're great with words. Yeah, putting all together, we've got opposition to the war, and we've seen that before, where parties have committed themselves, and organisations have committed themselves, but when it comes to the crunch, they've gone the opposite way and said more end up either supporting something that was in opposition to what was originally started. What was also too the right and left wings prior to the World War, the outbreak of the war, the right wing elements definitely controlled the majority of the most important political parties of the Second International, including those in Germany, Austria, England, France, Belgium, Scandinavia. Most of the rest, including the Party of the United States, were controlled by the centrists, together with the revisionists. The characteristics then of group at the time was closer and closer working with the right wing. Lenin said the centre is a realm of honeyed petty bourgeois phrases of internationalism in words and cowardly opportunism and fawning on the social chauvinists in deeds. He called centrists routine worshippers, slaves to rotten legality, corrupted by the atmosphere of parliamentarianism, etc. Sounds familiar, people? In the key German Social Democratic Party, and great mass of the membership supported the Kautsky-Huss liberal centrist tendency. So those two tendencies will then form that majority in the Second International. And I just want to make a comment too, because when the splits, there's books on about the splits of the International, Lenin wrote extensively on. I think you look and understand too that it had its historical roots going back to the late 1800s there. So the splits just didn't happen. You know, the cracks started to appear back in the late 1800s. It didn't actually appear just overnight on the eve of World War I. Things just don't happen. Obviously, they didn't all go to bed one night and wake up the next day, oh, well, we're going to support the rest of our bourgeoisie, respective bourgeoisies. What they did is it was actually quite an historical process leading up to it as well. And I think it's always keep that in mind as well. And things just didn't happen like that at the time. But I just sort of do too that generally the left wing of the period within and without the Second National fell into three categories. First, there were the syndicalist trade unions and anarchist groupings in the Latin countries, together with sprinklings of them in the United States, England, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and Latin America. We also had them here too via the Wobblies. These elements were political and usually also authorised sectarian revisionists from the left were unable to give the broad political leadership which was so badly needed by the misled working class. The second category of the current left-wing forces was the scattering of left-inclined workers and leaders who were to be found in the various countries such as Luxembourg, Lieberknecht, Mehring-Witsch and Pick in Germany, Radek and Marchaleski in Poland, Heinemann in England, Braun in Austria, Getzt in France, Garder and Panic Oak, I think, in Holland, Hugland in Sweden, and Debs and Haywood and De Leon in the United States. These relatively left elements were by no means a homogeneous group, and they had no definite program. By far the best developed among them was Rosa Luxemburg, leader of the weak left wing of the Social Democratic Party of Germany at the time. But I also too want to emphasise the third category of left forces at this time was the brain and heart, the whole international left wing were the Bolsheviks of Russia. They had both the necessary program leadership of a broad left wing. In Prague in January 1912, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party set the political pace of the Second International by expelling the Mensheviks. Sorry, just going to drink the water for a sec. Oh, sorry about that. I was about to really cough again. So I won't go on that a little bit further because there's a lot to read there. But I think what I'm seeing, there were the three sides of the left wing there, and you could see one was really developed, one was trying to get together, and the third was Marley. And instead of being one united bloc, thoroughly organised, and it's probably gave them, well, they all would say get left wing of the Second International in a weakened state where the right opportunists were with the centrists were more together. That's where they seem to have got their way. So that's when I said just a bit earlier, the right opportunism was starting to get organised. Now, previously they weren't, but then they started to get organised, and as things progressed, a lot more organised when it came down to onto the eve of World War One. Dustin, do you want to add anything onto that?
Covered. I'll just cover these comments right quick. Itatus is pointing out in the 1970s, there was a Swedish former Social Democrat prime minister who, Olof Palme, wanted to make workers the shareholders of their companies. And that's very positive. It's good to hear. Good to hear that pointed out. And Martin Zieler, to clarify, it was the Third International that made the leap in recognition of the national and colonial question, with the Second International planted the seeds. Did Foster ever recognize this or address this? And I think a lot of people associate the Third International with Lenin and Stalin, but the way this book is written, this is the formation of the internationals. So even though it was Lenin and Stalin that went on to basically lead, or Stalin lead the Third International, it was in the time period of the Second International that these ideas started taking root. And I really like the way William Z. Foster writes it with set time periods, like a history book. Easy to understand. Working class folks like ourselves can sit here and understand this, and it repeats itself a lot, and it builds up on itself. It's a really good text. So I'll just go right into the 25th section. This is on page 178 for those following along, and there's a country song called Waterloo, and this is I ain't gonna sing that one, but it's a good one. This is the Waterloo, Napoleon, who, went to invade Russia in the winter. Same thing happened with the Nazis. This was its downfall. This was the doing away of the Second International. This is the great betrayal of World War I. For anybody watching out there, I'm going to make this a little bit interactive. I'll give you a few seconds. What is the cause of World War I? Anybody out there want to put out in the comments what is the cause of World War I? Anyone paying attention? I might skip that while I'm waiting on that to see if anyone puts out what is the cause of World War I. Maybe I'll skip down a little further. World War I was hell. Human slaughter. Mass death, disease, just absolute horrible conditions that working people were killing each other. And it was so I didn't get any response, so I'll just go ahead and go into it. So that was a trick question. What caused World War I? A lot of people, if you read history, they'll say the cause of World War I was the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand. And although that kicked it off, that really wasn't the cause. No. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand may have set off World War I, but it was ultimately the material conditions of the antagonisms amongst the capitalist forces. It was a powder keg. Anything would have set it off. So the correct answer is growing inner imperialist contradictions. Itatus, both these conflict, both our comrades watching just answered the question correctly. It set the assassination set it off, but it was the contradiction. It was a powder keg. If it wasn't Archduke Ferdinand that was assassinated, it would have been something else. And I think this is interesting. This is the idea of scientific socialism. It is the class material, the material conditions and contradictions. This time Stalin put in Leninism. This was the contradiction of amongst the imperialists that caused World War One. This is kind of interesting now. If you look at the Republican Party and some of the more reactionary elements in the United States, like to say that COVID-19 caused the downfall of the economy, but it was the crisis of overproduction that has caused the downfall, the downfall, or the recent mass unemployment and the crisis of capitalism. Was not ultimately that the COVID-19 set it off, but it was unstable already because of the crisis of overproduction, and it was going to fall regardless. If COVID-19 ever would have came around, there eventually would have been a fall, and there might have been another trigger that set it off. So going on, World War One was hell. They call it the war to end all wars. Absolutely disgusting conditions. Think about waking up day after day with gangrene on your foot and nothing to eat and getting canker sores and constant fear of your death and bombs raining down on you. Just absolute hell that the working class was put on because of a direct result of the capitalists fighting against each other, the interest of the rich, not the interest of the working class, the interest of the rich and their imperialist gangs dividing up the world for further exploitation. When I was in 11th grade in high school, we read All Quiet on the Western Front. There's actually a good movie made about that in the United States, very good anti-war movie. And the book was a brilliant anti-war book that was from the perspective of the hell that the German workers had to go through fighting against the French, British, and Americans had to go through, and it showed the other side. The United States fought against the Germans. This showed the other side and the hell they gone through, and then it was teachers, petty bourgeois teachers, aligning with the interests of the capitalists that convinced young men to go and die and kill other poor workers. And when I was in that class, I think I made a comment. I was kind of shy. I made a comment and I said, I don't think this was close to the invasion of Iraq at this time, and I don't think the class got the understanding of the book. I think it went over their heads, including the teacher, because of the militarism in the United States. And I asked the question. I asked, how can they be right if they're telling us to do what's wrong? I was very moralistic back then. I don't believe it was heard. And the teacher heard it, and she's like, maybe you shouldn't say that to everyone. And she quickly moved the discussion along, because I was getting at the point of that book, that World War One was disastrous. Thousands and thousands of people dying, going through hellish conditions, just for the benefit of the capitalists. It's absolutely disgusting. And it continues to this day. It is in the interest of the imperialists to go and kill poor black and brown people in another country and send poor black and brown people here to do it. I get emotional about about this topic. I live right down the road from a major military base, Fort Bragg. Yeah. And you go down to Fort Bragg, and to this day, the barracks are in disrepair. Just recently, there was black mold in the ceiling, and there was clogged draining pipes and problems with the sewage. And this is supposedly the greatest military on earth that spends the most, and they can't get decent barracks for soldiers, because they're not. It isn't about us. It's about the interest of the capitalists, the interest of the imperialists. I'll move on. The Great Betrayal. U.S. was late to the war. They used the pretext of national defense, lies of war, just to this day. To this day, they use humanitarian intervention, somehow defending the people. Um, and this is opportunism led to it was opportunism that led to national chauvinism. And I like my position on Bernie Sanders is very critical. Um, Bernie Sanders has voted repeatedly to fund wars of aggression. This is the ultimate example of these socialists, people that the workers had faith. The workers thought were working in their interests. This was the representation, the so-called representations of the working class. When it came time, when it came push to shove, they allied with the capitalists against the interests of the working class. Just like Bernie Sanders has attacked Maduro, has attacked China, and has acted in the interest of the imperialists and not the interest of the working people. No offense to anyone, there's a lot of great people supporting Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders himself has proven himself in with and supporting to, or at least acquiescing to the imperialist camp.
Yep.
How the betrayal occurred. Germany, Austria, France, England, and Belgium for the war. Canada, Australia, New Zealand against the war, which is interesting because now the imperialist camp, which is all of the countries mentioned, it seems like Canada, Australia, New Zealand are part of the imperialist camp, but they like to give the presentation that they're less so. Germany, the largest group in the international, ultimately decided to go to war, and I think there's a lot of great comrades in Germany. There's a lot of great parties to this day. The MLPD is one of the biggest parties in the world, with a broad, massive support and a big presence in the labor movement in Germany. But there's a tendency within German socialists to downplay their role in the imperialist camp. And I think the German socialists, it's obvious America, the United States, the government here is leading the imperialist charge, but the Germans have a big role to play in that. And a lot of German socialists, even German Marxist Leninists and revolutionaries, will downplay or not address their own country's role in the imperialist camp. They used a moniker device of defense of the fatherland, which is lies to justify the war. Cowardly acts fused with half lies. Same lies to justify the Civil War. So what's interesting, so the First International helped to stop England and France from joining on the side of the Confederacy. Right. But if you look at it, the cause in the South here in the United States, to this day, there is propagated the idea of the lost cause, of that somehow the South was just defending themselves against the Northern aggression. This is the same argument that the German imperialists and the opportunists are using to justify their role in World War I. The one war they helped their countries not take part in. They're using the same backwards justification to do it, and it was just, and the justification and the lies are just a drama that underlines the underlying class contradiction, the opportunism created by their class interests were more in line with the imperialists and the bourgeoisie than the working class. The war was an imperialist war. It was to carve up the world. Reactionary forces sided with the national bourgeoisie. It created a vicious circle of the Second Internet in the Second International. The old trope from the Bible: "You killed me, so I'll kill you, eye for an eye." As the working people started killing each other, these bourgeois lies to defend the country became more ingrained and more emotional response, just for the killing and the wars to continue when it wasn't in the interest of either party. This ultimately, it was World War One that actually weakened the imperialists and helped lead to both the Russian and the German Revolution. That's what I have on that section. You want to respond?
Well, yeah, and it wasn't so more than just a tragedy as well. The social costs that happened in all the respective countries amongst the working class. Well, it was catastrophic. It was huge. In the time here in Australia, there was actual initial support for the war. I think even some of the workers think, "Oh, off we go." It was like, someone, we're reading some of the stories and hearing from some of the vets who are no longer with us now. That it was like a form of adventure. It was a thing to do. I joined up when I was 16, but the thing is, they turned their whole opinion about what imperialist war around. And when they actually went off into serious plot, I thought, what are we doing this for? The Labor Party here, that was mentioned in the book, originally voted against it at the last of the Congresses of the Second International. In fact, they just came out under the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, came out and fully supported the war, where the famous quote was, "Down to the last man, to the last shilling, to the last sheep." I'm not kidding you. That's what he said. We'll support this all the way. And I mean, and I was grateful. I was there, and basically the people that were celebrating were all the rich capitalists of the various imperial powers, the weapons manufacturers. Hip hip hooray for the war! Off you go, young man. And every bullet that's fired, every bomb that's exploded, profits made. So they had massive, and it was basically around that time. It was probably after a year. It was pretty much in this country after the Gallipoli campaign that the opinion against the war there was massive opposition to it, and there was actually massive opposition to it. The conscription was when the conscription vote went to the population and was voted down. We didn't want a compulsory, and there was a lot less people joining up to go off to war. And it's actually started the working class, unfortunately, through that experience, we realised what was it all about in the first place. So yeah, it was a complete disaster and catastrophe for the international working class. And I want to talk about the role of the Second International, which is going to be number 26 on page 186, and the opportunism. Well, this is the end result. That was the end result of right opportunism. This is what happens when we divide away from Marxist or scientific socialism. You divert and totally deflect from it, or go off on some sort of angle from an ultra leftist to a right opportunist trend. This is the World War One is a classic example. This is the tragic consequences of what can happen when you actually go stay away from the correct path. And on that, it's and that shows you that it is the end result of a right opportunism. So I think it's something, a vital lesson we had to learn from it. I mean, as I said, out of that area now, we obviously we talked about further, but we had the Russian Revolution, but we had some major, in Australia here, we had the Wadleys taking a leading role in some areas as well, but other socialists as well against the war. And actually, on that's what I want to say. At the end of it, and we'll talk further more about it, at the end of World War One, there was that much opposition, even amongst the soldiers that were volunteered to go off. There to go where they went off to war and then came back. They were so anti-war, and a lot of them actually became card-carrying communists in the 1920s. And we'll talk a bit more about that. So there you go. Look, I want to talk about the role of the Second International of 1889 to 1914. It's part 26, 186. And just this little part that Lenin says, the collapse of the Second International is the collapse of opportunism, which was growing on the soil put my glasses on again. Specific, the so-called peaceful historic epoch now past, and which practically dominated the international in the last years. The opportunists had long been preparing this collapse by rejecting the socialist revolution and substituting it for bourgeois reformism, by repudiating the class struggle with its inevitable transformation into a civil war at certain moments. And by preaching class collaboration, by preaching bourgeois chauvinism under the name of patriotism and defence of the fatherland, and ignoring or repudiating the fundamental truth of socialism early expressed in the Communist Manifesto, namely that the workers have no fatherland by confining themselves in their struggle against militarism to a sentimental Philistine point of view instead of recognising the necessity of a revolutionary war, proletariat of all countries against the bourgeoisie of all countries, by turning the necessary utilisation of bourgeois parliamentarism and bourgeois legality into a fetish of the legality, into a forgetfulness of the duty to have a legal forms of organisation, agitation in times of crisis. And I think that sums it there. Pretty much sums that up in that paragraph about the role of the Second International. And what was interesting too, with the outbreak of it, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were torn. Let's turn this into a revolutionary war. Let's turn the cannons and guns against our masters. And every war, and it's interesting after that. It's been really touched on a lot of the anti-war movements of the respective countries around the world now, but there's no talk if we ever come to it. Well, what happened? What about demanding that we turn the guns and the? I know this sounds a little bit. We've got to be careful. I don't want the authorities kicking the door down and arresting me, but sure. But that's got to be they come back in that mindset again, turning a revolution. Well, let's turn the guns and cannons onto our masters. The sheer problem of the world. So that's it's something going worthwhile, and that was picked up. And a person actually picked that up was James Connolly, who led the 1916 revolt in Ireland at the time. And it's we the proletariat and the trenches that turned the guns on the respective masters. It certainly would have turned out in quite a different state of affairs as well. But the price of opportunism, I think it's obviously we've seen the price of it then, and no doubt, look, right up to now, we've seen the price of rampant right opportunism everywhere, and it still rears its ugly head in one form or the other. And we understand this as well. We do pay the result of it if we divert from the correct path. I know some comments about there. What does Martin say? Dr. Chevergo seen on the road of deserters and replacements. Your country officer. Officer responds, my country. Officer falls in water barrel, shot by Bolshevik, presumably defiance of revolution. Good. And that happened too, actually. Interesting, even amongst Western allies. And that happened on the German and Austrian sides as well. There were actually a lot of reports of soldiers shooting their officers. That ordered them. There was one. I don't know how true it was, but one side where Anzac forces were in the Somme there, told to go over, and there was such a revolt. They knew they were going to get slaughtered. So what did someone decide to do? Took matters in their own hands and shot the officer in command there at the time. No, we're not going over. Bang, and that was it. And there was a lot of revolts amongst that. And we'll talk a little bit further as we go there. Well, as we move further. Now we're talking about the Zimmerwald movement, which. Was in there. Now, the early constructive work of the International as it proceeds, it flourished during what was principally a period of growth and expansion of world imperialism. So it's pretty much that's where its birth mark. And like we just said earlier, we between the two internationals and just at the end of the first international, the Paris Commune, and then but really pretty much that sort of period onwards, there was a relative stability after all that in Europe and continental Europe. Colonies and stuff to expand further. So hence that's where the seeds of opportunism arose as well. And we saw great expansion of it. In Australia here, great expansion of railways, of ports, development of agriculture, mining, and some industry came in. So we saw back then, even though early forms, we saw a great expansion of that happening everywhere. And obviously, that's where a lot of that was developed for the time. So there was always a consistent lot of work. At the time, people coming from predominantly Britain, but no doubt parts of Europe, and elsewhere, coming to Australia, helped build it. Western Australia went through a boom. Actually, when the economic crisis of the 1890s happened, fortunately, Western Australia was an injection of British capital because that was all part of the Federation of Australia to build the Coolgardie pipe scheme, which you can actually see from satellites. The major water pipeline from Perth or the Mundaring Weir there in Perth leads out to Kalgoorlie to supply the goldfields. And it only triggered because there was discovery of gold in the Western Australian goldfields around Southern Cross, etc. But there was massive expansion there for WA as well at the time. So it's just a little example of what was happening at the time. But on the downside of it, workers were labouring in all sorts of miserable conditions. The interesting, the inner city where predominantly a lot of the inner cities where predominantly the working class lived or regional areas, they lived in appalling conditions. yeah, I understand it's in England, especially, or UK or Britain. They lived in damp conditions, horrible conditions. You'd either freeze to death in winter, or or in summer would be unbearably hot. And even when they came out here, it wasn't even any better. You're lucky to, all these things. It was quite a romantic view. I think when you see the gentrification of our cities, pardon me again. There's a romantic view of what the inner city was like. They're actually really tough areas. And growing up, all the time, working class people didn't have all the modern things we had now. We quite enjoy it. Even that's all going out. It's so and at work that was actually really dangerous conditions as well. But if you work, it doesn't matter if you worked in a mill or a big factory, you're bound to be, your threat to your own life or your physical well-being was huge, because there was no protection against the moving machinery. You worked long hours. You really laboured from dawn, from the crack of dawn to right till the evening. So yeah, all these things, and also life expansion, and the life expectancy of working class people at the time wasn't like we've got now. People living into their 70s, 80s, and even into their 90s. So you'd be lucky if you did work late up to in your 60s. I looked at this picture from Liverpool in the UK, and this was actually a picture of them in the 50s. Waterfront workers, and there were people. This person looked really aged, but in fact he was in his 30s. Their life expectancy, if they got to 40s, early 40s, for them, and that's talking about just the last century, more than the last century. There, that was quite fortunate for them, but yeah, they didn't. And so life expectancy for working class people wasn't huge either. But the amount of productivity just increased tenfold as well. So we had some big changes in technology through that time as well. The capitalists realised, instead of like having 1,000 workers doing something, employ half that number and have the machines doing the rest, and that comes down to basic political economy again as well. So we did see that the downside, the dark side of in their own countries at the time. The conditions for working class people weren't that great. Yes, they were winning some concessions, but at the end of the day, it was still unbearable. And unfortunately, there was those out there who developed a romantic view of that era. There was nothing romantic about it at all for working class people. They were really tough conditions. And actually, I remember my grandparents, I mentioned my grandfathers telling me about this, some of the stories they grew up, even in the early part of the 1920s and stuff. They went to school with no shoes on. Where rain, hail, shine, doesn't matter if freezing cold or hot, they had no shoes and all these other things. So just little things were just like that. A lot of working class people didn't. And so it flows on about the price of opportunism. Well, I actually touched on that, and I think, basically World War One that's the ultimate price of opportunism, and when we don't keep it in check, no one wants the movements either. And I think Marxism, and I think Lenin's actually quietly pointed that out, of the danger of outright opportunism, but also too, remember, ultra leftism as well. We've got to always be aware of those dangers. If you deviate from Marxism, these are certain mistakes, and it wasn't a mistake. This is where it could possibly land. And actually, I see it today. Syria was mentioned before. There was in the commentaries, and it was disgraceful. When Syria was attacked by these terrorist groups, and it wasn't the Free Syrian Army; they were terrorists. They weren't even Syrian. Let's put a face to that. But what happened there? The amount of people on the left took an ultra-leftist position and did not support the Syrian government and its people. Mind you, the people of Syria included trade unions, included the Communist Party, and the broad masses of the people supported the Syrian government. It's a secular nation, and it's got some high standing of living and everything else. And look what happened. And that's just what happens when you take an ultra leftist position or an opportunist trend, or not supporting it. And and still to this day, they've still got to struggle to get rest of their have complete control of their country. And actually, when I won't mention the group, when they said about Russia being imperialist and stuff, and I pulled them up on it, I said, wrong. Russia is not imperialist. But the fact is, they were invited into Syria to help the Syrian government, and it was a correct thing to do. From do it. And actually, without the Russians stepping in there, Syria would have been a complete catastrophe. There would be nothing left of it. It'd be like Libya now, was what we've seen. And same with Libya as well. But people took an ultra-leftist or a right opportunist trend. Look at Libya now. That's just, and to me, that's just disgraceful. and I'm sorry to go a little bit, sound a bit subjective there, but I find it damn right disgraceful. Those that go on the left, or what we call the left, taking those positions and not making a correct anti-imperialist, at least an anti-imperialist, anti-war position about that. In fact, there was one party here, I won't mention their name, they said, well, we're against the war in Libya, but we don't support Gaddafi either. So what's this mysterious third way they're talking about? You're either one or the other. It's yeah, yeah. So as I said, everyone was outrule on that. So we can even see now, because all the one showed us back then, but what opportunism can do now, and we've always got to be remember, like Lenin did in his time, and like Lenin the Bolsheviks did in their time, to struggle against opportunism. So we should be doing, we need to keep consistently struggling against that as well. So, is there anything you want to add on that?
We're approaching the 2.5 hour.
Oh yeah, we've been in.
Let's see. That was a lot. I really like what you said about Syria and Russia. His status comments, interesting comments about Germany in 1914 and some of the differences between the current parties in Germany. That's interesting. Good to comment. I just wanted to make a final note, kind of applying the Second International to like today's time period. And the problem when Lenin and Stalin led the Russian Revolution, the problem wasn't there wasn't mass organizations, socialist organizations. It was the problem that those socialist organizations were opportunists. And in the current day, in the United States at least, our organizations, socialist organizations, were destroyed in the McCarthy period, and we don't have socialist organizations. So my understanding, in the current period, in Lenin's time, a secret organization that could lead to revolution, which was the missing thing, was what was necessary. But I would argue in the United States today, what we need to be doing is taking influence from the Second International, and what little democratic things we have left, we need to be building co-ops and educational groups, and get scientific socialism and Marxism out to as many people as possible in the current period. Any final remarks?
Well, that's a good point actually to raise, and then we've got to build on what we've got, and then I think we've got a lot of rebuilding too we have to do as well for the movements, and that we've obviously over the years has been such decline. I like what Caleb says: get out of the movement and get into the masses. I think that is a correct thing to do. We do need to actually get back into the masses of the working class people and make those connections, be part of their struggle, and help them. Because what we're going to remember at the end of the day is social, communist, Marxist, it's the class that comes to power. We've got to have, and it goes right back to the manifesto. Our primary role is to help the working class achieve power. And that's how we go about it. We've certainly got a big task in our respective countries ahead of us. It's not like going to be an overnight thing. It's not going to happen within a week or a month. It will certainly. And look, but on that too, the material conditions are changing as well pretty quickly at the moment. So I was talking with your comrades about it, and it's just amazing how the last year or two, just things have been really taking off. We're seeing what's happening in the US, but we're also seeing around the world. It's COVID-19, certainly not the cause of the crisis. The crisis was bad due to happen. Bourgeois economists were meaning the last few years it was going to happen. The crisis just have obviously fast-tracked everything and triggered a few other things as well. So we've certainly got a lot of work to do, but there's such a rich history to learn from this as well. For both what happened back around Lenin's time, but in how we can apply it now and what lessons we need to draw from. I think it's vitally important about that, and keeping to the fundamental line. It's like an old comrade who's passed away many years ago. I'll mention his name, Vic Williams, and he taught me a lot. But what he said to myself and a couple of other comrades is, once you find the fundamental line, you stick to it. And what we're saying, don't get diverted by all these other trends. We've got to stick to the fundamental line and find the fundamental line and stick to it. And I think it's a good little quote he said to me, and I got that. I said, yeah, it's the working class we formatted. So I think I mentioned on some kind of Caleb's live chats. I actually typed it in, find the fundamental line and stick to it. And that's I think that's vitally important. We do this. Someone sent me a message on that. Too funny. Okay. Yeah, so look, just on that, do we continue through, because it's been 2.5 hours. So, I mean, we've got to about, just so while we were talking, we've got up to, well, number 32 is where the third international starts. So we've got another 4 or 5 chapters to go quickly run through. Obviously, a lot on the Russian revolutions and the other revolutions.
You just finished 28, didn't you?
27. Sorry.
27.
28.
No, you just finished 26.
26.
Right?
Now we're on 27. Sorry, confused me. Yeah.
27 is the next section. 27 is the next section.
Yeah.
That's part 3. That's the next study.
Okay. All right. So we want to leave it here? We'll just and then we'll continue on next time, or
yeah. We're covering the part 2. Part 3's next discussion.
Okay.
So this next weekend, this next Saturday is 4th of July, and
Okay.
I'm going to partake in festivities. I'd rather not do it next week. How's next Sunday?
Next Sunday's fine.
Not the 4th of July, the one after that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you mean the week Sunday after fortnight, Sunday week, or your Saturday week? Yeah.
It would be the July 4th is Saturday. It would be the 11th. Mine the 12th of yours.
Yeah. Yep, that's fine. Yeah, so we'll make it the following weekend. Mm-hmm.
Or the 4th. Yeah, it would be your 12th, my 11th.
Yep, that's fine.
That'll work same time?
Yep, we'll do that. And everyone should be happy at the same time. It's 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, 8 o'clock in Western Australia. So the comrades here are happy with that. And I hope it's not too late for you guys in the US either this time. But
okay. We might change that, but tentatively for those that are watching, the next study, if we don't announce it, you can check out my Facebook page or message me, email me, workingclassrevolt@gmail.com for any questions or concerns. It should be the 11th here in the United States, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank everyone for being a part of this and helping this grow. Share this out.
And thank you. Thank you.